Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. Thank you as always for stopping by. Let me start. I had a fascinating discussion with Standard Chartered's Global Head of Trade, Farooq Siddiqi, and the head of the Middle East and Africa, Birju Sanghrajka. Maybe check how I pronounce his surname a couple of times, and he was right to do so, about trade, the new digital ecosystem, Standard Chartered's investments in Ripple. Really very interesting. And one of the most interesting points that Farooq said, he said he went back to look at the last big trade wars that we'd had, and he said the really big one was in the early 1930s. It was farm related, and he said it cratered GDP, global GDP, by 2/3, and that really got me thinking. I don't think we're in that kind of scenario now. Macro thoughts, Portugal is now seen as more solid than Italy by the markets. Portugal's 5-year default probability has fallen to 5.7%, way below Italy's. JP Morgan, this is via Reuters Jamie, the biggest risks to markets this year comes from the US, according to JP Morgan Market Symposium held last week. Citing US political dynamics and rising interest rates, investors may be less willing to buy the dips as the year progresses. 28th of August last year, I said Washington has metasized into an epicenter of risk. Donald Trump refers. And there I was saying, and talk of a unipolar US-dominated world have largely evaporated. Have a look at this. This is a 3-month annualized core inflation, seems to be topping out at 2%, which is an interesting development for now. And I must say, I personally thought inflation would be higher than it is now. But I think I'd underestimated the power of the always-on digital economy to keep bringing prices lower. Home thoughts. What matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you remember it. Gabriel García Márquez. It is not true that people stop pursuing dreams because they grow old. They grow old because they stop pursuing dreams. To him, she seemed so beautiful, so seductive, so different from ordinary people, that he could not understand why no one was as disturbed as he by the clicking of her heels on the paving stones, and why no one else's heart was wild with the breeze stirred by the size of her veils, and why everyone did not go mad with the movements of her braid, the flight of her hands, the gold of her laughter. He had not missed a single one of her gestures, not one of the indications of her character, but he did not dare approach her for fear of destroying the spell. But when a woman decides to sleep with a man, there is no wall she will not scale, no fortress she will not destroy, no moral consideration she will not ignore. At its very root, there is no God worth worrying about. And the final one, it was inevitable, the scent of bitter almonds. And if you haven't tasted bitter almond, maybe you should, because I have. Not very tasty. Always reminded him of the fate of unrequited love. I just like this photograph, but it is of 4 newly procured planes for Air Tanzania, expected in the country next July. I like the photo of Kilimanjaro. Let's move on to political reflections. Why is Africa giving old people in their late 60s and 90s to lead us instead of young and vibrant leaders? To lead us where? To the grave? Asks Mo Ibrahim. I wrote a piece in 2014 after the events in Ouagadougou. Of course, we've had subsequent events again in recent last few days. But I was saying then, what's clear is that a very young, very informed, very connected African youth demographic is set to alter the existing equilibrium between the rulers and the subjects, and a rebalancing has begun. Look, it's never going to be linear, but directionally I think I will stand by that comment. Very interesting pivot by Tom Friedman in the New York Times. Memo to the President on Saudi Arabia. Memo to the President from the US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, if we had one. And then talking about the visit of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, otherwise known as MBS, and saying it's only a matter of time before King Salman turns over the reins of power to MBS, who's already the effective ruler. He's definitely bold. I can think of no one else in the ruling family who would have put in place the profound social, religious and economic reforms that he's dared to do, and all at once. Then talking about he even got the clerics to green light expressions of love on Valentine's Day for the first time. It's well worth reading in full. As a result, MBS grew up with a lot of resentment and disdain for his lazy cousins who got obscenely rich, along with the big merchants close to them. His anti-corruption campaign was meant to stem the tide of graft, but it also had elements of revenge and a power and money grab, and still has 56 wealthy Saudis under house arrest, not in the Ritz-Carlton, which I believe is reopened. Asking, foreign and Saudi investors might well be asking, if I put money into Saudi Arabia or partner with a Saudi, can that wealth be confiscated without warning at the Ritz-Carlton? Yes, it can. At the same time, we need to tell MBS you can be an effective king with real legitimacy, or you can buy yachts, chateaus, and Leonardo da Vinci's like your cousins, but you can't do both. He has to understand he's becoming an important figure on the world stage, and he needs to cultivate the same reputation his father has: clean, modest, conciliatory. On the management side, MBS's team is too small and contains a couple of minister bullies close to him who are in way over their heads and who bring out his worst instincts and offer terrible advice, some of which led to his failed overreaches in Yemen, Lebanon and Qatar. And while MBS is a creative reformer, he has a fierce temper. Most of his ministers are afraid to challenge him or give him the candid, caring advice he needs. Then he says if MBS chases Iran everywhere, Tehran will sap all his strength. It will be death by 1,000 cuts. Interesting pivot. You see what I mean? Especially if you read the previous article, which was a sort of fan mail extraordinaire. 13th of November last year, I wrote about the paranoia in the palaces in Saudi Arabia, and I said it's real and existential. And I also said what is clear is Bibi Netanyahu, MBZ, Jared Kushner, and a Trump carte blanche have all leveraged this existential paranoia to effect not a state capture, but a kingdom capture. Evidence of this paranoia was that comment, how can I communicate with them while they prepare for the arrival of Al-Mahdi al-Montazar? And interestingly, the day before he launched his Night of the Long Knives, guess who was coaching him into the early hours of the morning? It was Ivanka Trump's husband, Jared Kushner. And again, if you look at the personalities that caught up in that dragnet, you'll see what I'm talking about. Fisk concludes that, put bluntly, is clawing down all his rivals. I said this is an unprecedented moment in the history of the kingdom, and the most perilous moment for the House of Saud that I can recall. Taking on Iran looks like the straw that breaks the camel's back. Big news out of Korea as Seoul says North and South Korea have agreed to hold summit talks in late April. The South says as well North Korea is open to denuclearization and talks with the US and South Korea. I think they've always said that, but it's been picked up slightly differently post Kim Yo-jong's visit, which was all about soft power. Water is fluid, soft and yielding, but water will wear away rock, which is rigid and cannot yield. As a rule, whatever is fluid, soft and yielding will overcome whatever is rigid and hard. This is another paradox. What is soft is strong. I said then South Korea is said to be peeled off, and going by his puppy dog smiles, President Moon River will be in Pyongyang before he can pronounce Kim Yo-jong correctly. South Korea's currency rallied on this news. This is a chart from FastFT. SpaceX has launched a commercial satellite while Florida sleeps. Take me back to one of my favourite quotes, Thomas Pynchon. It is a curve, each of them feels. Look at that curve as you see it launched. Unmistakably, it is the parabola. They must have guessed, once or twice guessed, and refused to believe that everything always collectively had been moving toward that purified shape, latent in the sky, that shape of no surprise, no second chance, no return. Very interesting article in Sputnik, of all places. China unlikely to match India's strength in the Indian Ocean in the near future. Amid growing rivalry between Beijing and New Delhi in the Indian Ocean, China is not likely to overtake India in naval strength in the region in the next 2 to 3 decades, they say. In response, Prime Minister Modi secured access to naval facilities in Oman during an official visit last month. Earlier this year, India reached an agreement with the Seychelles to build military infrastructure on the Assumption Island. In the same article, India is stronger in the Indian Ocean because China has to go through choke points in Southeast Asia. Their logistic line is very stretched. Although they have an aircraft carrier, it would take them a long time, probably decades, to incorporate that into an aircraft carrier battle group, which would allow them to achieve sea control in the Indian Ocean. In this sense, I would say it would take maybe 2 to 3 decades. India still has a great advantage over the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean. I'm not talking about the West Pacific, I'm only talking about the Indian Ocean. And he's an Indian chap called Gurpreet Khurana, an Indian Navy captain, an executive director of the National Maritime Foundation in New Delhi. I think he's deluded. Because of India's geographical position, the Indian Ocean becomes very critical to the country's national security interests. In other parts of the world, such as the Indo-Pacific, we do not have the luxury of the West, which has fought wars and got over it. We still have traditional military insecurities. India still has adversary relations with China. And then saying, although the Indian Navy has a distinct advantage over the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean so far, China realizes that that's why they're trying to offset India's advantage by building facilities in the Indian Ocean. For example, Djibouti, Gwadar could all have Chinese naval bases, and Maldives probably as well. So I totally disagree with that. I think China is going to overtake India very quickly in terms of naval strength in the Indian Ocean. I think they've largely consolidated that position in the South China Sea. They're now expanding out of that to consolidate their position in the Indian Ocean. And I said that March this month, make no mistake, China has elbowed everyone aside in the South China Sea and is now accelerating its position in the Indian Ocean. I appreciate, I said, that the USS Carl Vinson is sailing around the South China Sea, but make no mistake, China has elbowed everyone aside in that sea and is now accelerating its position in the Indian Ocean. And I quoted a chap called David Brewster, who said it seems that we're in the middle of a base race across the Indian Ocean. On that note, this is a photograph I took of Pemba Island in Mozambique, which is also on the Indian Ocean. In that article I wrote about China, I said Xi Jinping is making a pygmy of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is surrounded on all sides. That article was Xi Jinping, President for Life. In this photograph, you see the official visit of His Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, the Emir of the State of Qatar, who was visiting Didier Reynders. Trump confronted Gary Cohn on trade just hours before Cohn's resignation, and obviously created quite a dramatic reaction in the markets, primarily because he seems to be the last orthodox economist man standing. June 5, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy lies on the floor at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. News on Gary Cohn's resignation flooring the dollar. I was labeling this a few hours ago. Let's move on to the currency markets. Euro dollar 124.24, dollar index 89.50, Japanese yen, where's that? 105.59. Swiss franc 0.9368, the pound 138.98, the Australian dollar last trading at 78.05, Aussie GDP expanded 0.4% on the quarter, India rupee 64.925, South Korean won 1067.355, Brazilian real 320.96, Egyptian pound 17.6320, and the rand 11.83. Dollar index, I'll put up a 3-month chart. Trump muffled the rebound. Euro dollar last trading at 124.24, 125.60 is capping it for now. Nobody's searching for Bitcoin anymore, says Ed van der Waalt. That's an interesting development because there's a high correlation between searches and prices. WPP suffers the worst stock slump since 1999 after Chief Executive Officer Martin Sorrell slashed the profit outlook and predicted a year of no growth. There's a real sense of shock and awe what's happened to his business model, said Alex de Groot. There is a stark reminder of the significant challenges WPP faces. Gold, let's have a look at where that is, $1333.50. Crude oil, $61.95. It's been doing a lot of work around here. It hasn't got back to those highs we saw in early January. Emerging markets under pressure as debt mounts. The premise which lenders keep lending to borrowers as they become more indebted is that the backdrop will stay benign. Since the crisis, debt in emerging markets has surged. In China, it rose from 171% of GDP at the end of 2008 to 295% at the end of last September. The combined debts of a group of 26 large emerging markets monitored by the IIF rose from 148% of GDP at the end of 2008 to 211% last September. He warns that buyers of local currency emerging market bonds have done well in the rally in the past 2 years as investors have sought to take advantage of the improving growth outlook are going to lose out. Miss Gibbs at the IIF shares that view. It feels like we're at an inflection point. We have gone for so long with a sense of underlying calm, but now the Fed is more hawkish, the ECB and BOJ are less dovish, and consensus views are being shaken across the board. I wrote that piece in February called Halcyon Days. I said emerging markets and frontier market borrowers surely need to get their skates on, pull the trigger real quick on any borrowing they've been considering for this year. Look at this Asian currency performance this year, Philippine peso being sold off. Now, Sub-Saharan Africa, and I did an interview on the BBC about this, Tillerson has come to Africa, and ahead of his visit he said to the Africans, "You are hooked on Chinese debt," according to Martina Steves. In speech just delivered before he takes off, he said China encourages dependency. China is the biggest trading partner to Sub-Saharan Africa by far. US is fifth. Tillerson is offering $533 million in food aid for African famine. US Secretary of State says China investment in Africa has led to more debt. This is about debt traps. And it's true. And I think in part, it's the responsibility of the recipient governments of these Chinese loans who have not spent the money effectively. They've creamed off far too much off the top. So you've got all this infrastructure going in where you pay double what it really costs. And people have privatized that differential. Then we got Russia's Lavrov in town as well, and he's set to meet Tillerson in Addis Ababa. He's very pithy and very erudite. You remember this quote: if it looks like a terrorist, if it acts like a terrorist, if it walks like a terrorist, if it fights like a terrorist, it's a terrorist, right? Fueling atrocities, oil and war in South Sudan. Very interesting article here again about Nile Petroleum Corporation as being a slush fund for the ruling party in Sudan. But the last paragraph is what really caught my interest. A report released in January 2018 by the regional anti-money laundering body, the East and Southern Africa Anti-Money Laundering Group, demonstrated that the Kenyan banking system in particular faces major concerns from de-risking by global banks that are concerned about the risks flowing through Kenya and the inability or unwillingness of Kenyan banks to address them. Taking action against illicit flows from South Sudan is a direct way that Kenyan banks and regulators can demonstrate sounder practices to the international community, particularly at a time when the country is taking on increasing levels of debt from Europe and facing stronger scrutiny from the IMF. Continuing to enable or at least failing to prevent the proceeds of South Sudanese corruption to transit through the Kenyan banking system will continue to grow as a risk factor and could easily imperil the financial system. As demonstrated by this investigation, these transactions can be identified and must be stopped. Quite hard-hitting, I thought. Senegal is set to issue a new Eurobond. It's in the market selling a 9-year Euro tranche with initial guidance of 5.125 to 5.25%. And they're selling a 29-year dollar bond. Guidance there was around 7.25%. US sanctions blow from Mnangagwa as Trump says Harare is still a threat. Extended sanctions against Zimbabwe for another year. Very disappointed about that. I wrote in November about Zimbabwe and I said the genie's out of the bottle. Pictures from Harare on Saturday spoke to people's power, which is a genie which will be difficult, if not impossible, to put back in its bottle. It's like Christmas, said one marcher. Get a warning for whoever takes over Zimbabwe. If the next leader does the same, we're going to come out again. And I agree with US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Yamamoto, who said it's a transition to a new era for Zimbabwe. That's really what we're hoping for. I think it is. The question is, will the birth pangs be okay or painful? Kabila defies poll demand as Congo drifts toward conflict. One person who knows the president well says the video games and luxury cars enthusiast does not want to leave office because he's afraid of tomorrow, partly because of what happened to his father. The people who are closest to him are his brother and sister, and he doesn't trust anyone outside his family. He says little, and the people who can read his silence and interpret what he doesn't say have the most influence. If he, Kabila, says tomorrow, I won't be a candidate, the national tension will decrease massively, but it would trigger conflict within the family and the ruling elite because they will all start fighting for supremacy. They want the building to remain, they just want the concierge to go. Kabila's failure is that unlike other leaders in the region, he has not been able to ensure an internal transition or change the constitution. The church, of course, has become his most formidable adversary. Father Jean-Claude Tabé, the priest at St. Benoit's Church in Kinshasa, where one demonstrator was shot dead in the February 25 protests, said the police tactics spoke volumes about Mr. Kabila's intentions. He just wants to retain power, and he'll do whatever it takes to do so. I wrote previously about the street. He's been very careful to keep the numbers, although it's horrible, but below the radar. The South African economy grew by 1.3% in 2017 compared to a revised 0.6% in 2016, much better than people expected. Agriculture in particular registered the highest growth of 37.5%, which is extraordinary when you consider what's happening in the Cape. South African all share is minus 0.44% year to date. Dollar versus rand still doing some work here, but eventually we're going to break below 11. We're at 11.83. Nigerian all shares up 14.03% year to date. Ghana 2018 GDP growth seen at 8.3%. Growing gangbusters over there in Accra versus 6.8% budget target. Ghana Stock Exchange is the outlier. It's up 27.74% year to date. Rwanda's economy is to grow 6.5% in 2018, says the central bank. In Rwanda, we all see better climate conditions this year that will impact positively on our economic performance. Kenya, our response to the author's absurd demand for US intervention in Kenya is a loud no thanks. So said the PS, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Kamal, who I meet occasionally in the Fight Club. He was responding to an article published late last month by former US ambassadors to Kenya, Johnny Carson and Mark Bellamy, in which they call for US intervention in Kenya. Our response to the author's absurd demand for US intervention in Kenya is a loud no thanks, he said. Kenya Airways looks up market for financial salvation, wide-ranging interview interview by Sebastian Mikosh, who's the CEO at Kenya Airways, with Reuters' Duncan Miriri. So he's a Polish native. I've met him in person a couple of times, we had a long conversation. He told Reuters he plans to roll out a new Economy Plus class by the end of the year, designed for business and wealthy leisure travelers, including growing numbers of American tourists and executives from dozens of Nairobi-based US firms. We are working on a pretty big reshape of the on-board experience, he said. The first direct flight from Nairobi to New York by any airline from October, plan Mikosh said was known as the $100 million project, for the revenue the daily flight is expected to bring in. We still have to prove that we can produce an operating profit, and he hasn't got much time. That is the biggest challenge that we have in an environment where you have a lot of competition. Mikosh describes the state-backed competition as his biggest fear as he tries to turn around a publicly listed firm, owned 48.9% by the government and 7.8% by Air France-KLM, and attract a strategic investor. That's interesting. His plans mark a shift from a focus on African air passenger demand, which the IATA sees growing by almost 6% over the next decade due to increasing economic output and poor road and rail links. Tickets to New York have begun retailing for $1,000 return, compared with $1,500 for an indirect flight. The company reports full-year results in June had a $251 million loss in the financial year 2016-2017. Sell more tickets and cut costs. It's always the same game. Kenya Airways share price data, they're on rich wrap-ups if you're going to take a look. HF Group gets 1.5 billion shillings from Badea Bank, which is the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa. That's an interesting positive development for them. Share price is down 1.44% so far this year. Nairobi all shares up 5.74% this year, less than 1% of a record closing high. KenGen's trading just on its 50-day moving average. Look at this chart. NSE 20 is up 0.65% so far this year. Thank you again for listening.